The Bible claims that it was Solomon that built the temple for Yahweh, but there are clues in the text that point to a different story. In this video, I'll attempt to show that Jerusalem was founded as a Phoenician colony, the temple was built by the king of Tyre, and it was never intended to be a temple for Yahweh. This may be confusing for some, as the Bible clearly tells us that it was King Solomon that built the temple for Yahweh. In fact, the Bible tells us 11 times that it was Solomon that built the temple. If you're familiar with my previous work, you'll know that this is a propaganda technique that I refer to as the redundant lie. And the framework that we need to read the temple narrative is that of propaganda. This presents us with the difficult task of trying to separate the propaganda from the historical narrative. This is not easy, as propaganda is written in a way to disguise it from being recognized as propaganda. But there are clues in the text, and if we can identify glitches, ambiguities, and propaganda techniques, we have a chance at identifying the true historical narrative. So if Solomon didn't build the temple, who did? In order to answer that question, we need to ask two questions. Who else is in the biblical narrative? But not just anyone in the narrative, we also need to ask who is closely associated with the building of the temple. The person that fulfills both of these questions the best is King Hiram of Tyre. The Bible admits that King Hiram provided the materials for the temple. It also admits that Hiram's builders were involved in the building of the temple. But there is also another person named Hiram, who was also from Tyre. This was the bronze craftsman that built all of the bronze elements of the temple. So the bronze craftsman and the king of Tyre both had the same name. Many see this as only a coincidence. But it's actually another propaganda technique, combining or splitting identities. I've written a blog post previously about the combining of the identities of Israel and Jacob, as well as Jerusalem and Zion. But in this case, we have the splitting of identities with the two Hirams. This is done to prevent Hiram from being too closely associated with the building of the temple. It also provides a plausible misunderstanding for the original reader. Oh, you thought King Hiram built the temple? No. He just provided the materials and some of the workers. Oh, you thought King Hiram created the bronze objects? No. That was another man named Hiram, also from Tyre. But that Hiram was an Israelite. So this raises the question, why would King Hiram of Tyre build a temple in Jerusalem? To answer that question, we have to understand a little bit more about Phoenician colonies. Major Phoenician cities such as Tyre would establish colonies in order to promote trade. These colonies would then be required to send annual tithes back to their mother city. This gives us a different perspective when the Bible tells us that Solomon sent wheat and olive oil to King Hiram year after year. These colonies would also copy the architecture of their mother cities. And the design of Solomon's temple seems to have been influenced by Phoenician temples, with many scholars believing that the Temple of Solomon bore similarities to Phoenician temples. Another feature of Phoenician colonies were Tophets. Tophets were sacred sites built outside the city where sacrifices and other rituals were carried out. And although we don't know when the Tophet was established, the biblical text tells us that there was a Tophet outside of Jerusalem. On this map of Phoenician colonies, you can see that the colonies were established on coastal areas. This raises the question, why would a seafaring people build a colony so far inland? I propose that it was in order to establish a new trade route. Jerusalem may have been a stepping stone between Tyre and Ezion-Geber. The Bible tells us that King Solomon built a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber. But again, we find Hiram here with his servants and sailors. This trade route would have given Hiram access to the Red Sea and beyond. The city of Joppa was the closest port on Jerusalem's north side. And it's in 2 Chronicles that tells us it was Joppa where Hiram sent the materials. We also know that Joppa was also at one time a Phoenician settlement. Two other locations may have played a part in this trade route as well. The Bible tells us that Gezer was one of the cities that Solomon had rebuilt, and Tamar was a fortress south of Jerusalem. These two locations may have been built to secure the new trade route. All of these cities taken together would have provided a trade route from Ezion-Geber to Tyre, and this forms the basis for the decision by King Hiram to form a colony in Jerusalem. This puts the visit by Queen of Sheba in a new light. Did she come to visit Solomon because of his fame in relation to the name of Yahweh? Or did she come because of the trade route established with Tyre? It's hard to say exactly when and why Jerusalem broke away from the Phoenician city, but it may have had something to do with the Philistines taking over Joppa, or Jaffa, and thus severing the trade route. So this brings us to the next question of who was worshipped at the temple. Which god was the temple built for? The Bible refers to it as the house of the Lord, or the temple of Yahweh, but this again is another redundant lie, thus indicating it was built for another god. There seems to be glitches in the text that would indicate that it wasn't built for Yahweh. The brazen pillars is one example of this. There were many temples with such columns, including Phoenician temples. Each column typically represented a deity. And the Bible tells us the pillars had names, Jachin and Boaz, with some scholars believing that Boaz was a corruption of the name Baal. Regardless, the pillars likely would have been a male and female deity. Then there's the glitch of the Ark of the Covenant. The Bible tells us that the poles used to carry the Ark may have been too long to fit in the Holy of Holies. Assuming the Ark of the Covenant was actually associated with Yahweh, it doesn't seem like the temple was designed for him. Then there's the glitch of the molten sea, also called Sea of Bronze or Brazen Sea. We're not actually told what this bronze container of water was for. Many assume it was to refill the bronze lavers. But if that's the case, then it's not very practical. The heat in the bronze would have caused a lot of evaporation. Most water was stored in underground cisterns. And what's with the bowls that bore it on their backs? This seems odd in light of the golden calf fiasco in Exodus. One scholar believes that instead of brazen sea, the phrase should be interpreted as the sea has been constrained. This idea of having a sea as part of worship makes a lot of sense if the worshippers were seafaring people, like the Phoenicians. After the destruction of Solomon's temple, when the temple was rebuilt, the pillars in the molten sea were not reconstructed, suggesting that perhaps they were never associated with Yahweh. So if Yahweh wasn't worshipped there, which god was? Well, we have some Phoenician possibilities, such as Baal, Astarte, and Melkart. The Phoenician Baal was the chief deity, and his statues were sometimes flanked by bulls, reminding us of the Brazen Sea once again. Melkart, or the Tyrian Baal, was the chief deity in each colony. He was a sea god that was exported to many Phoenician colonies around the Mediterranean. This god seems to be the leading candidate for who the temple was built for, although there may be some other possibilities. The Bible tells us that Solomon built high places for Chemosh and Moloch. When speaking of Jerusalem's Tophet, it also mentions Moloch, although Moloch was a variant name for Baal, which may have just been another name for Melkart. Another possibility is Asherah. The Bible tells us that King Manasseh put Asherah in the Holy of Holies. But what is one of the most interesting possibilities is Shalom, who was the god of dusk in Canaanite religions. There is a city mentioned in historical records named Jerusalem. Many believe that this was an early name for Jerusalem, and some interpret it as meaning city founded by Shalom. Some of you might be asking, what about David? Isn't he part of the founding of Jerusalem? Didn't he come before Solomon? And the answer to that is no. Contrary to what the Bible tells us, David never reigned in Jerusalem, only in Hebron. This is beyond the scope of today's video, but I'll mention a few things. Solomon was not David's son. It's another redundant lie. Absalom was not David's son. Again, a redundant lie. The city of David is a propaganda technique that I call the generic juke. The phrase City of David was essentially a smokescreen to prevent us from seeing that David was never in Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 15, David inexplicably leaves one of the best defensive positions in the area in response to Absalom. And even in 2 Samuel 5, we're told that King Hiram built the palace. So it seems that Solomon's temple isn't what the Bible claims it to be, and it wasn't Solomon's temple at all. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. And please like, share, and subscribe.